Rabbi Tovia Singer got asked the question, how do Christians deal with the Bible saying Elijah comes before the Messiah? Let's listen to his answer.
In this case, it really depends which book in the Bible, in the Christian Bible, you're looking at. The book of John and the book of Matthew do not agree on this.
I mean, you've heard the rabbi's voice. Look at his face as he speaks. How are you going to think he's mistaken? Or worse, is he lying to his audience? This is why videos like this are important. Never allow confidence alone to convince you of something, because that is one way people end up in hell, and matters of faith are too important to mess up. So for the rest of the video, you will see why Rabbi Tovia Singer is wrong about the Gospels not agreeing with each other. Then you will also see how Malachi ends different than what Rabbi Tovia Singer talks about. And before the end, you will see why the 2 points Rabbi Singer makes about why Jesus cannot be the Messiah fail miserably. You already heard Rabbi Tovia Singer say the Gospels disagree, but let's listen to why he thinks so. Then I can begin to show you the problems with what he said.
In the view of Matthew, in Matthew 11, John the Baptist was Elijah the prophet. That's Matthew 11:14.
So first, Rabbi Tovia Singer quotes one verse where Jesus calls John the Baptist Elijah. I'm not going to debate in this video which gospel was first, but Rabbi Singer believes Matthew is first and then tries to pit it against the last gospel, John. Here's what he says about John.
And in fact, the book of John opens with John the Baptist being asked, "Who are you? What is your role?" And he's asked, "Are you in fact Elijah the prophet?" And he says, "No."
This is a strange argument. Every time John the Baptist gets linked with Elijah like this, it's somebody else speaking about him. So for example, an angel speaks about John and Elijah. Jesus also speaks about this connection 2 times. You'll see proof of this in a moment. But the only time it's not an angel or Jesus is John chapter 1. In John 1, John is speaking. The people ask him several questions, but the important one for now is if he is Elijah. John the Baptist says no. And this is why it's strange. Rabbi Tovia Singer said John disagrees with the other Gospels, but how? John the Gospel writer did not say John the Baptist was not Elijah. All he did was share what John said. There's a big difference. Imagine you wrote about Tovia Singer in a book and you said, Rabbi Tovia Singer said Jerusalem is the greatest city in the world. And then I turned around and said, you think Jerusalem is the greatest city in the world. You would think, what on earth is Israel talking about? Right? Because you never said it. You were only mentioning what the rabbi said. That is what the rabbi is doing here. John the Baptist could have lied. He's not perfect. He could have been mistaken and not known he was Elijah, or he was doing what makes the most sense. And this also shows how the Gospels agree. He was saying he is not Elijah in the literal sense. John's Gospel was lost. Anyone reading it would know exactly why it's not a problem for John the Baptist to say he is not Elijah. And this leads me to the main problem with Rabbi Singer's argument. He is trying to pick one verse instead of taking all of the verses on this subject and make an informed decision. Imagine if this was a police investigation. You're Sherlock Holmes, for example, and you have 5 pieces of evidence for your case. All of these are of equal value. Would you look at all 5 pieces of evidence or only look at 2? With more evidence, you could make a better case, couldn't you? And this is what happens when you actually take all the evidence about John the Baptist and Elijah. Let me show you, and then we can cover the ending of the book of Malachi. In Matthew chapter 11, Jesus talks about John and says, John the Baptist is Elijah who was to come. The question we must ask ourselves is, what does Jesus mean by this? Does Jesus mean this is Elijah in the literal sense? Does he mean this is a reincarnation of Elijah? Or does Jesus mean John the Baptist came in the power of Elijah? As you continue in Matthew and consider the evidence in all of the Gospels, it becomes clear. In Matthew chapter 17, Jesus speaks about this again. This is also covered in Mark chapter 9 as well. This time, the disciples ask him, why do the scribes say Elijah must come before the Messiah? In verse 11, Jesus says it is true Elijah must come first, and he has come already. And they did what they wished with him. Matthew already told us, as I showed you, what Jesus said about Elijah. So it's clear this is about John the Baptist. Jesus is saying John the Baptist was the Elijah who would come before himself, the Messiah. You could start thinking Jesus does think John the Baptist is Elijah in a literal sense, but there is more evidence to help us. More evidence in Luke's gospel and more in this passage. Because a question you should ask is, why did the disciples in Matthew and Mark ask Jesus about Elijah right here? Right before this, Matthew and Mark both write about the Mount of Transfiguration, Jesus taking 3 of his disciples up a mountain and revealing his glory. 2 people showed up, Moses and Elijah. Luke also mentions Moses and Elijah showing up too in Luke chapter 9. Luke goes further though than the other 2 and tells us they appeared in glory. But the point is, Jesus saw Elijah and Moses. Peter, James and John also saw Elijah and Moses. So it makes sense why the disciples would ask about Elijah at this point. But this also shows us the disciples and Jesus did not think John the Baptist was Elijah in a literal sense. They both speak about Elijah as someone else. Think about it. They knew John the Baptist. Some of them were even John's disciples before they followed Jesus. But they're right when they say Elijah was on the mountain, not John. Jesus is not trying to confuse his disciples who saw Elijah in a literal sense. By this example alone, it's clear Jesus is not calling John Elijah in a literal sense. The Old Testament didn't teach reincarnation, and this leaves only one answer, the right answer. And this is the same answer that angel Gabriel shares in Luke chapter 1. In Luke chapter 1, the angel Gabriel gets sent to John's father and tells him his son will be special. He will prepare people for the coming of the Lord. He will come in the spirit and power of Elijah. He will not be Elijah, but he will come in the power of Elijah. And Gabriel quotes the end of Malachi. This leads us to the next point. At the end of Malachi, it speaks about Elijah coming to restore things so the Lord does not curse the earth. But Rabbi Singer talks about world peace, destroying the temple, and why Jesus is not the Messiah.
What is most critical is that the world will be restored. There'll be a repentance. There'll be world peace. The world will be transformed forever.
The truth is, Christians believe in 2 comings of the Messiah. Rabbinic Judaism, which Rabbi Singer follows, believes in 2 Messiahs. The Messiah, son of Joseph, gets killed in war, and Messiah, the son of David, who wins and brings peace. This is why the Talmud has debates about why the Old Testament talks about 2 comings of Messiah. The prophets speak of Messiah coming on a donkey in Zechariah 9, but the prophets also speak of Messiah coming riding the clouds in Daniel 7. But Rabbi Tovia Singer knows this. But my point is, Jesus is right. John was the Elijah who was coming. And this is important because the nation rejected him. And when they rejected him, they in turn rejected the Messiah. This is one reason Jesus said the temple would get destroyed in the 1st century, and it was. But what else happened in the 1st century? This was the beginning of people worshipping the God of the Bible from all corners of the world like never before. Not belief by the sword or because of money, but Jesus' coming is what brings this unheard of worldwide devotion to God from people in every part of the world, making a free choice to serve God. That sounds like the coming of the Messiah to me. Because when you follow Jesus' teachings of love, this fulfills the whole law. And this is what draws people from all walks of life into relationship with God. But Rabbi Singer went on to talk about wars between Christians. But Christians are not perfect. Jesus is. But people call themselves Christians all of the time. Jesus said people would know who his disciples were by how they loved each other. And this is important to know based on what he says next. Now let's hear Rabbi Singer's 2 points based on Matthew 10, verse 34 to 36.
Jesus, we are told in Matthew chapter 10, says that I did not come to bring peace on earth, but the sword. Mothers and daughters against each other, and in fact, the man's enemies will be those of his own household. That kind of Messiah we don't want, and most importantly, most germane.
Now, before you hear his last point, let me deal with the first point here. Rabbi Singer says this is not the kind of Messiah we want. But the irony is that Jesus is quoting the Old Testament here. He's quoting Micah chapter 7, verse 5 to 6. This is a time where Micah the prophet sees evil all around. Micah wanted things to obviously turn around, but everyone was betraying each other. Jesus' point is his coming divides, and his coming will show who is good and who is evil, and will betray their family for evil. In this passage, Jesus encourages his disciples to be bold. He He also tells them to remember they are valuable to God. And he says the time is now here where people who you think love you will betray you, like in Micah. Context matters. But what Rabbi Singer said next was shocking to hear from someone so skilled in the Old Testament.
That's not the Messiah that is foretold in the Hebrew scriptures. It bears no resemblance to that. Mashiach is coming.
Wait, Rabbi Tovia Singer said there is no example of Messiah dividing people, even though you saw the context of that passage. I wouldn't say what the rabbi said. Psalm chapter 2, for example, Zechariah 14. I could quote passages where the Messiah is defeating his enemies who reject his rule, or his coming bringing division between those who serve God and those who hate him. All I want you to do is to look at the evidence, because seeking truth above all else has eternal consequences. God bless.